Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ARRT webinar for radiation therapy educators. I'm Lisa Bartenhaken, and I serve as the program director for the radiation therapy program at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And this year I have the privilege of serving as the president on the ARRT Board of Trustees. So I know everybody has been very anxious. It's a challenging time for you, your students, and all the therapists across the country. So we really appreciate you joining us today. Today's webinar will begin with a brief introduction of ARRT's pandemic actions that they've been working on. However, most of this webinar will focus on your questions. Before I turn the microphone over to Jerry Reed, the ARRT Executive Director, I'd like to introduce Zachary Siegel. He's a cognitive scientist at ARRT. He's going to be our moderator today, and he has a few housekeeping items for us all. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. For everyone here on the call, we will be using the Q&A function during today's webinar. On the bottom of your computer or mobile screen, you should see a button that will bring up the Q&A window. We will ask you to type in your questions to this window after the presentation is complete, because we hope to answer several of your questions right away. Please pay careful attention to the questions that have already been asked, because you can click a thumbs up on that screen to vote for a specific question. I will present the most popular questions to our panel, so voting will go further than repeating an existing question. This session is also being recorded, so don't worry if you are missed part of an answer. We will make the recording available after the webinar. With that said, I will turn the microphone over to Jerry Reed.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I have a brief presentation, starting with just a summary of what's been happening at the ARRT in the 6 weeks since the World Health Organization declared a pandemic back on March 11th. We've covered a lot of ground, just a couple of examples. We've stabilized our operations by executing our pre-existing pandemic plan. We've transitioned our 100 staff members from our normal work from the office model to a work from home model. We've brought our call centers up to high capacity under the work from home. That includes our initial certification and continuing registration call centers. And when Pearson VUE, our vendor for administrating our exams, closed its test centers to all candidates except EMTs and nurses, we successfully advocated for radiation therapy examinees, radiography examinees, nuclear medicine, technology examinees, and sonography examinees to have access to Pearson VUE centers as part of the essential professionals that would be able to continue to test. We have resumed processing candidate applications, and those are just a few of the examples. Now, I wish I could include in the list that we've developed a solution for the challenges that you and your students are facing in meeting the ARRT eligibility requirements, but we're not there yet. I will share with you during the presentation the process that we've been following and looking for solutions. And I say solutions as a plural because I don't believe there's a single approach that's going to take care of every program's challenges. And in addition to sharing a criteria for the solutions, we want to recruit your help in identifying and vetting possible solutions, not just for the immediate conditions, but for the conditions that are likely to exist for some period of time after we get through this initial phase. Next slide, please. Well, we don't want to take any shortcuts in our approach that will undermine the ARRT's credentials, particularly those credentials that are issued in the spring or summer of 2020. We want to keep the long view in mind, and for those reasons, our goals are to preserve the long-term integrity of the radiation therapy credential, We want to, secondly, support realistic access to obtaining and maintaining the ARRT credential. And third, we want to adapt to the current conditions while keeping the first two goals in mind. Next slide, please. The approach that we're taking is to consider temporary modifications to the requirements and not waivers of the requirement. Again, if we went the waiver route, simply said you don't need to meet the requirements, we potentially would be creating the situation where credentials that were issued spring or summer of 2020 were always suspect in the minds of the profession and employers. Next slide, please. Of course, our eligibility standards include education, ethics, and examination. We will touch base on each of those during the presentation. I suspect education is going to be your greatest concern, and that's where we'll spend the most of our time, I'm sure, with the question and answers. Next slide, please. Well, for each of the three standards, education, ethics, and examination, we have requirements, ways to document that the candidate has met those standards. Of course, for education, we have the associate degree minimum requirement. We have didactic competency requirements and clinical competency requirements as listed in that document for radiation therapy, the didactic and clinical competency requirements. For ethics, we have the Code of Ethics and we have the Rules of Ethics, and of course the examination requirement as well. Next slide. So when the board started talking about potential modifications, we thought about what are kind of the categories of modifications that might be addressed. The first one was deadlines. As you know, we have addressed the deadline issue right up front. And for most deadlines, we extended them 90 days. A number of those are related to the examinations. For example, the examination window. If someone's getting close to the end, there's an automatic 90-day extension. Our 3-year rule. If someone's getting close to the end of their 3 years that they have to pass the examination, we will extend. And a number of other deadlines will have an automatic extension, or if not automatic, a process will review the specifics in a situation and consider extending the deadlines. So the second category of modifications or potential modifications is in sequencing. As you know, right now, all educational requirements have to be completed prior to sitting for the examination. That's not always been the case historically. At one point, individuals could sit for the examination before they completed their educational requirements, and we would simply hold their examination results until they finished all requirements. So sequencing is another potential area that we have talked about and is a possible modification. And the third is looking for ways to satisfy the intent of our requirements, even if it's not exactly the way we currently require them to be met. So alternative ways of documenting that the requirements have been met. A good example of that, and I think one that's been mentioned on a number of the communities and social media, was whether or not simulations could be used in some cases for some of the clinical competencies. Next slide, please. Well, running through the 3 different standards, ethics, the Code of Ethics is aspirational. The Rules of Ethics are enforceable. We are not really anticipating any changes to the requirements for ethics. Our ethics department is functioning. They are reviewing potential ethics cases. Their processes are continuing, so we see no need to make any changes to our ethics requirements. Next slide, please. The examination requirement. There are 3 areas within the exams that potentially could be changed. For example, the structure, specifically the content and length. I know there are certification organizations who have modified the structure of their examinations. We are not considering any changes to the content or length of the examination. Second category is pass point, the number of questions you have to answer correctly in order to pass the examination. We are not anticipating any changes to the pass point. And finally, standardized administration of the examination. We are not anticipating changes to the way we administer the exam at this point, and I'll explain why on the next slide. Next slide, please. Well, as I said, Pearson VUE is our test administration vendor, and we've gone through in the last March and April quite a range of conditions with our test administration situation. We went from full testing capacity, all VUE centers were open and working at 100%. We then went into social distancing, which basically reduced the capacity of Pearson VUE centers by 50% by spreading people out. They also went through a phase of issuing gloves and masks and whatnot. That was pretty short phase. We went to 0 testing capacity March 16th, so about a month ago. Then moved into selective testing capacity, which was when the EMTs and nurses were the only ones allowed to test. Again, we quickly advocated for radiation therapists and our other selective disciplines to have access, and were granted that access. Granted, it's still reduced capacity because they're still taking measures for protection like social distancing. Not all of the centers are open. Not all of the centers that are open at full operating hours. So it is reduced, but there are opportunities to test right now. We anticipate that we will be moving May 1st to a return to social distancing, so a greater capacity, still reduced. And then at some point, and we don't know when yet, full testing capacity will return. And of course, that will be dependent upon local policies, whether or not that particular state has a stay-at-home order in place, whether or not local areas where the testing centers have additional requirements in terms of operations. So we can't tell you exactly when all testing centers will be open and testing at full capacity. We do realize that there will be a backlog. The individuals who would have tested in March and April, not just for ARRT, but for Pearson VUE's other clients, they are not getting through the process as quickly as they normally would. If it's not EMTs or nurses or radiologic technologists, some other selective professions, they may not be getting through it all right now. But we will return to full testing capacity, we're sure. And we're not sure what steps Pearson VUE might be able to take to increase their capacity to clear out the backlog, but we will be holding those discussions as conditions warrant. Next slide, please. Well, as I said, I know that your prime interest is in education, so let's talk about that. The 3 primary requirements within our education standard is the associate degree minimum. We do not anticipate any changes to that. We're not currently discussing changes to the minimum associate degree. Second, the didactic competencies. Right now, we don't anticipate changes to that. It's really the clinical competencies where we're hearing the most feedback on, and the board has been discussing and continues to discuss how we might be able to make temporary modifications that still meet the intent of the requirements for the clinical competencies. Again, we're looking to you to help us come up with creative ideas, particularly ideas that are consistent with the criteria we mentioned, preserving the long-term integrity of the credential. Next slide, please. Well, the way we're seeking input is first through this webinar, speaking to all the radiation therapy program directors, letting you know what we've been thinking about, the criteria that we're working toward, and we will get some of your input today, but an hour is not nearly enough to cover all of the ground. We will be sending you a survey either later this week or early next week that will get your individual programs information about what roadblocks you're currently facing and what ideas you may have to surmount those roadblocks. We also are looking for ideas via email channels. Our preferred route is for you to log on to your program director account in ARRT and submit your questions through that account. If in fact you don't have access to that account, you're not on campus for whatever reason, you can't get into your individual program director account for your school, we have set up another channel that you can email your questions, suggestions to program directors at arrt.org. We will respond to all of those questions that we received, and we will funnel ideas to the board for their deliberations. Next slide, please. In just a minute, I'll turn it back over to Zach, and he will run through again the process for submitting your questions on this webinar. But before we get there, next slide, please. I would like to introduce the other panelists. Of course, Lisa has already introduced herself. You know her as one of your fellow program directors. Third in the first row is Kevin Rush. He is our Senior Director of Credentialing Operations. First in the second row, JJ Powell is our Director of Education Requirements. Next to her is Terry Vatterat. She is our Initial Certification Supervisor. And Zach Siegel, you've met, he's introduced himself. But Lisa, myself, Kevin, JJ, and Terry will be responding to your questions. Lisa, of course, as president of the ARRT board, will certainly take the information that we gather here, share it with her fellow board members, and add that to the process of our deliberations. So, Zach, let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jerry. As a reminder for everybody here, please do use the Q&A function in order to answer questions. There will be a button on the bottom of your screen, which has a Q&A, looks like a speech bubble. You'll be able to click on that and answer questions. You will also be able to see questions that others have asked. And then if you do see a question that has been asked that you are particularly interested in, please do give that question a thumbs up so that you're able to bring that to the top, and I will read that for our group. So while you are looking to add questions to the Q&A, I do have a few here that we have pre-prepared for our panel. The first question I have is, how can we submit application forms for students?
Terry, would you like to take that one?
Yes, thank you, Jerry. We still need you to submit the requests for the primary eligibility pathway applications in the usual manner using our program director's website. We are currently mailing out applications in the order our office receives the requests. If you need applications mailed to your home address due to the school closures, please call the program director's line to make these arrangements, and we can certainly do that.
Thank you. We have our first question from the Q&A function. Will students currently scheduled for early May be rescheduled?
Kevin or JJ, you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take that.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, JJ, if you want to. At this point, depending on what Pearson View tells us, at this point they are planning to open May 1st. They had not indicated they were going to reschedule any of the people currently scheduled for that date, but that may change depending on what state they're in, depending on what the requirements are for the area where the student may have scheduled the exam.
Thank you. We have our next question. Our program requires many more competencies than were required by the ARRT. If students have completed competencies that are at a more difficult level than those that they still need, can we utilize the more complex competency to meet their requirement?
This is Jerry. That would be an example of something that we will feed into the board discussion as they talk about, would that meet the intent of the ARRT competency? I think as we get ideas like that, and obviously I'm not in radiation therapy, so that would not have occurred to me as a possibility of something happening. So excellent example of, again, an individual program that might be able to meet the competencies in a manner other than our typical manner. So we will feed that into the board's discussion.
Thank you. Our next question. If students complete all of their competencies, do they need to meet all of the clinical hours our program offers? JJ,
would you like to tackle that one?
So, sure, Jerry. ARRT doesn't set clinical hour requirements. What you'll need to do with that is check with your accreditor for your school before you would make any variance to your clinical hours. ARRT just sets the requirements for competencies that we have in our documents. So I definitely would encourage you to reach out to your accreditor for that information.
And as this is Jerry, as JJ says, we do require that you complete the program. So if in fact doing less clinical hours than you normally would still allows the individual to be deemed a graduate of the program or having completed the program, that would also not cause a problem for meeting ARRT requirements. Correct, JJ?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. To our next question, what is the stance on simulated competencies?
This is Jerry. I'll start with that. As I'm sure all the program directors realize, there are limits to how many of the ARRT competencies that can be simulated. At this point, there are also criteria for how those simulations must occur in the cases where they can be used. Those have not changed at this point. There is no guarantee that the board will change those. However, that is one of the board's current discussions as to, can we, one, increase the number of simulations for those students who are very near the end of the program. Again, for example, if someone's in their first year of the program, hopefully we will be back to normal situation and they won't need to deviate from the way you normally comp the students out. But for students who are near the end of the program, the board is talking about, is it possible to increase the number of procedures that can be simulated? And is it possible to perhaps tweak the criteria that we currently have for meeting those simulations or simulating those competencies in a way that makes it more feasible for the students to do that. So at this point, what we allow for simulations still stands, but that is an active discussion by the board. Anybody else want to add to that?
I do have one question that I believe could contribute as well. We have a question about whether the ARRT simulator system has been looked at as a possible option for clinical simulation.
This is Jerry. We did receive that as a question outside of this webinar, and that will feed into the board's discussion as to whether or not that's a possibility. I think oftentimes our response here today, as I said, we don't have the answers yet, is going to be, we can feed that into the discussion. We're looking for specifics. We don't want to propose a solution that really doesn't make it any easier or more feasible for students to meet the competencies. So that's another one that we will feed in to the board's discussion. Anybody else have any additional on that? Okay.
All right. Our next question I have here is whether we have a timeline for the board being able to provide more concrete direction for their students.
We do not have a specific timeline. As I said, we realize it's been 6 weeks since the pandemic was declared. We know that programs were starting to have access to clinical sites, having difficulty there even prior to that. We are working on it. I know everyone would like to have a clear pathway sooner rather than later. Certainly the board and staff would love to have that. It's not really enjoyable to respond that we don't have a solution for you at this point. We are looking out to other healthcare professions to see what sort of solutions they are undertaking. Certainly, we're not the only profession where clinical experience and competencies are an issue. There are many others, and we're looking to them to see how they're addressing it. We haven't hit upon a model quite yet that seems to fit well for us, but we are working as quickly as we can to come up with solutions that preserve the integrity of the credential.
Thank you. The next question I have, are we able to complete the students' final required competencies in a virtual manner using Zoom as well as treatment plans? Would still cover all questions required in a regular competency. Students are not allowed in the clinic with patients on campus, so it would be difficult for some of their students to finish competencies. It does relate a little bit to our previous question, but it is a unique scenario.
It is, and that's part of the board's discussion as to if both in terms of would it meet the current criteria that we have for performing simulations, and two, the second issue there is, can the number of simulations allowed be increased? Those are the two questions. The board has talked about various virtual models that might be used, and we've not reached a decision yet as to whether or not that would be acceptable, but it is one of the models under active discussion.
Thank you. The next question I have, is there a timeline for the new list of graduate confirmations for students that are set to write the exam?
JJ, do you want to take that one?
I'm actually going to have Terry answer this. I think she has a better idea just from being in the office there.
Okay. Terry, is your mic on?
Okay, I'll just take a, since Terry doesn't seem to be able to respond. If they're meeting by graduate confirmation for our students, I'm not sure on the list, if you're talking about the list that's in the program director site where you actually go in and confirm completion, but that gets updated as we process applications. As far as candidate status reports being mailed out from the office, when we update candidate status report information, we are getting back to where we're updating information and being able to mail that out. So it's kind of all tied in with application processing. We've got to address those applications that are in all stages of processing, as well as those that have already been completed and now need to be adjusted.
Thank you. Our next question, is ART considering a structure such as been adopted elsewhere where students could move directly into the workforce through an authorization from the accrediting body rather than going through the process of the exam?
This is Jerry. The board has talked about models that really fall under, as I said in my slideshow, kind of a resequencing of requirements where perhaps the individual could go out and meet their competencies in the workforce. Exactly what sort of recognition would be issued while they are completing their competencies. That, of course, is beyond just ARRT's decision. We can make the decision regarding our requirements, whether or not we can resequence and allow someone to meet requirements outside of the educational program, i.e. actually on the job. But the accreditation issues, obviously whether or not the school policies allow that, that's kind of outside our control, but the board has talked about resequencing and allowing the clinicals to be satisfied while on the job to kind of finish, kind of complete the loop in terms of meeting ART requirements so that someone has met all requirements and can be fully certified and registered. That is one of the models that the board has talked about. We're not at a decision point on that one yet either.
Excellent, thank you. Next question I have, I will rephrase it slightly. What is the best way for the program directors to get information from ARRT about specific guidelines for simulated competencies that would be acceptable as the board continues to make those decisions?
Basically, our outlets that are specific to the current COVID-19 situation is on our COVID-19 page. There's separate sections for students, for educators. We have opportunities to enhance the information that is available out there. What we will do, even if in fact what we would hope to do is put out very definitive information, what we will have to do until we get to the definitive information is simply post information about the status of our deliberations. Early on, we didn't want to keep posting that we're considering this, we're considering that. We really would like to give the definitive information. I can't give you a timeline as to when we'll get to that point. We are working on it, but what we can post out there is currently, here are the requirements. We're considering some of the things we've talked about here and keep that updated. Now that we have operations stabilized and things, kind of the everyday things back up and running more routinely, we can turn our attention to keeping that information, I believe, richer and more up to date.
Thank you. Our next question, what is the timeline for application processing? This particular individual submitted an application in mid-March, but the students haven't heard back just yet.
JJ or Terry or Kevin?
I can take that one.
Thank you.
All applications that were received before March 15th were processed and the candidate status reports were sent out. Any applications that were received between March 15th and 27th, they're in various stages of processing, and as soon as we can get them processed, we will send out the candidate status reports. If they were received between March 28th and April 11th, or even today, we're processing everything that comes in as it comes in. We have an on-site crew as of April 13th, but it's very, very limited, and it's going to take longer than what we have experienced in the past.
Thank you. Our next question. If a student has completed their exams but has not filled out a competency form, but the therapist can verify they are competent for the procedure, is it acceptable for a therapist to sign off on their competency?
JJ or Terry, do you want to weigh in on that one? I guess weigh in on it in terms of what right now would be acceptable without modifications to the requirements.
So as far as competencies in that, you would definitely need to look at what your policies are for your program. You know, you don't want the therapist signing off and that not following your policies and procedures that are in place for your program and to jeopardize that. And it really kind of depends on what manner you're using to sign off on competency and that type of thing, and how you make sure that your records are up to date, so that if we did have to request information from you to prove that all the clinical competency requirements were met for that student, you would have the necessary documentation to do that.
And just to reinforce, as JJ says, ARRT doesn't require that you turn in your program's documentation routinely on whether or not a student has met the competency. We do, of course, require that you as program director sign off that they have met that competency. The documentation process is not specified by ARRT, so that's an internal program issue. However, ARRT does require that you sign off that you are confident that they have met the ARRT competencies.
Thank you. Our next question is similar to some we've heard, but is a bit different vein. Can treatment planning competencies and dose calculations be done on campus using real patient data?
JJ or Terry, under the current requirements, would that meet the intent?
I think this is one of those areas that we definitely would want the board to look at and include that in their discussions about alternatives.
And this is, Kevin, I guess I would ask a follow-up question to this for clarity. If the question is, can the treatment planning comp and dose calcs be done on campus if they're using real patient data, I think it would end up going through the same process, that the treatment plan would be completed before it was used on a patient. It would be reviewed by the dosimetrist, by the physicist. Of course, the physician would look at it much in the same way that they would do a practice or phantom calculation. It would still be checked beforehand. So I'm not sure if someone wants to clarify that, but the process of doing those are the same and the outcome is the same. And I believe some programs are doing it that way, but I would need some clarity on, I'm sorry, this is Kevin, would need some clarity on that to be able to better answer that.
That might be a good example of one. If you can send it via one of those two avenues we discussed in the slideshow, either your program director account, or if you don't have access to that, through the program director .art.org email. Just if you could clarify that, if it doesn't roll up on our Q&A during this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question: if the students meet ARRT requirements, but if not completed additional competency requirements for their program, could those remaining competencies be simulated?
This is Jerry. ART requires that the ART competencies, clinical competencies, be met. We require that the individual completes the program. So if within the program policies, they can simulate the procedures, if that's okay with the program, so that they have completed the program and they do in fact meet the ART clinical competencies as specified, then I do not believe that that would cause us a problem. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that one?
I would agree with that, as long as they're, we just need to know that our requirements are met, and it's just ultimately program completion.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question: how far in advance should applications be submitted if they're not exactly sure when the student will graduate?
Kevin, JJ, or Terry, want to weigh in on that one?
I can take that one. This is Terry. I would wait until you know when the students will graduate. You can send them in up to 3 months in advance, but because this situation is still unfolding, if you don't know exactly, it might be best to wait.
Terry, this is Jerry. Just for my information, if they send it in, if the scheduled date is 3 months or less, and if someone happens to go over the 3 months, they don't right now graduate when they were expected to graduate, we wouldn't send the application back after 3 months and a day, would we?
No, they would just need to change the date in their program director account.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification.
Thank you. Our next question: what if students are not able to complete the practical part of CPR before graduation or their exam?
Kevin, JJ, or Terry, would you like to try that one on?
This is JJ. Where CPR is a requirement. I mean, we do. It's like all other ARRT requirements. It does need to be met before they would be eligible to take the exam.
Thank you. Our next question: this particular program is a Bachelor of Science in which students complete 2 concentrations, for example, junior year radiography and senior year RT. Students cannot take the exam for the first concentration until the second year program is complete, because that's when they graduate. Have we heard of other programs like this? And if so, has there been a discussion to modify to allow students to prepare and take the exam for their first year concentration while waiting to resume the second?
Kevin, JJ, or Terry?
This is JJ. We do know those programs are out there, and a lot of this has to do with the accreditation of your program, because you need to sign off that the program has been completed as the program is accredited. So if your accreditation states that both of those pathways have to be completed before the program is complete, then we would need that to occur. This is another one that you could submit in, and definitely we can get this on the list for the board to look at, but no guarantees that that would change, and you should also be talking with the accreditor for your program.
Thank you. Our next question, you mentioned sequency during the presentation. What options are being considered? For example, letting students sit for the registry, but not verifying credentials until competencies are met, or perhaps a timeline to complete that post-graduation.
This is Jerry. The board has discussed that as a possibility, again, and kind of brainstorming how might we change the current normal sequencing. Some of the things that we need to complete our exploration on that as an option are legal issues. If in fact we issue any sort of recognition prior to someone meeting all of our requirements, what sort of legal liability might that raise? Our radiation therapy certification program is also accredited by the NCCA. It has requirements regarding modifying your eligibility requirements. I've reached out to them to ask what sort of dispensations are there during the current time for deviating from the model under which you were accredited by. It has a number of different aspects that we are gathering information to see whether or not that meets our criterion of preserving the integrity. Of course, if we lost NCCA accreditation, that would certainly have implications for the integrity of our credential. If there are legal liability issues that can't be surmounted, that would raise issues. So there are, every one of the solutions has implications that after we think about our brainstorm and come up with a, what if we did this, we need to investigate the implications of that. So we've talked about the resequencing. We're in the phase of checking to see what the implications are. So the board has those in front of them and they can make an informed decision as to whether or not that's a model that works.
Thank you. A few questions coming up related to mail and campuses being closed. The first here, can applications be sent directly to students if their campus is closed, or perhaps an alternate mailing address?
Terry or JJ?
I can take that one. The applications have to go to the program director. They have to be marked for that school, so they have to be distributed to the program director, and that from there, the program director can mail the applications to the students so they can fill out their part, and then they would have to be mailed back to the program director for filling out the program director section.
And as a follow-up to that, what should program directors do if they're unable to receive mail because they can't get it through their university and they're working from home?
They can call the office, the program director line, and request that we send the application packet to their home address. That's perfectly fine.
Excellent. Thank you. With our next question, for this unique group of graduates, could the ARRT consider using CQR and SSA on a shorter time frame, perhaps after a single year rather than 10, in order to help with the situation?
This is Jerry. That It's an interesting idea. I'll say that we haven't thought about that specifically. We will put that into the hopper and talk about it.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question, has the board considered at-home virtual testing rather than relying solely on testing centers?
This is Jerry. We have heard of other organizations thinking about remote proctored or online proctored administrations. In general, the standardized administration of high stakes exams is an important part of not just the security, but the integrity of the results that we get from someone's taking the exam. Although we use online proctored, or we offer online proctor for the SSA under the CQR, it really is a lower stakes situation that we're comfortable with. For a high stakes certification exam using online proctored, we're not comfortable at this point. As I indicated, even though the Pearson professional centers, the brick and mortar test centers, aren't at full capacity yet, we aren't at the point of feeling that we need to deviate from our standardized administration with all of the benefits that it provides us for high stakes exams. Having said that, there also, as everybody is doing business on the internet now, it does have some implications for online proctored administrations. Kevin, I think you probably have more information about Pearson VUE challenges. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's, and this is Kevin, I think it goes back to exam security, the fairness in the administration of the exam, that they've not fully nailed down. And that is why they have gone to this essential, I apologize, my mic was up. That's why Pearson has gone to looking at the essential services, because they want to find a way to do it that they're confident in. This was the most direct way to do it. They had not expressed full confidence in the ability to proctor an exam to the same level of security that we expect at the test centers. So that is still ongoing. That is still undergoing review.
Thank you. We have time for two very short questions yet. Our first question is anything being done at the moment to move the application process to an online system?
This is Jerry. We do have a project in our list to move that to online. We did look at the possibility of accelerating that transition, and in essence, to make all the changes, the coding, all the IT work. To do that, pulled the IT department away from other projects that we needed to get done. We also looked at, with the current paper model for the application, what sort of modifications might we be able to make that a little bit easier to do, or how can we basically leverage online tools to make that happen. And we have not cracked that nut at this point. JJ or Terry or Kevin, anything to add to that?
This is Kevin. I know that in discussions with our project management office and IT resources, it was going to be a very intense project, which many of the resources that are being used in this modified approach to the way we're doing things right now many of the IT resources are being used to make that happen, to keep everyone who is off-site up and running. We would have to pull several of those people off to move that online, and it would still be several weeks, if not months away. And then it would need to be redone. So at this point, it's not something that can be easily done and could potentially result in things slowing down even more than where we currently are. So it's been shelved at the moment. They are still investigating, but at this point, we are still holding on doing anything with that.
Thank you.
And Zach, actually, I spotted a question about timeline. When is the board going to meet? Consider modifications, if I can just weigh in on that one quickly.
That was going to be my next one, actually. Go for it.
Perfect. Actually, the board isn't waiting for their normally scheduled board meetings to discuss this. They have pretty much every day been involved with their online trustee forum discussing the possibilities. So that is an ongoing continuous process. It's really not anchored to its fixed schedule meetings. It really is an online process where they're talking about it on an ongoing basis.
Excellent. Thank you. With that, I don't believe we have time to dig into any more questions. So I do want to thank you, Jerry, and the rest of our panelists. Following this call, ARRT will prepare the recording and send a link to all of those that were invited to this webinar. We will also post the webinar link to ARRT's COVID-19 update page, which you can access through the ARRT website. We want to thank all of you for your participation today and for your service. Thank you.